Thank you, Hollis. This reminds me of when I was a kid, Golden Pond, going to those meetings at Golden Pond School with our parents and grandparents when they were originally resisting the TVA's takeover of all of our property over there. So it's good to see this crowd, and thank you, Hollis and Wade, for organizing this. It's good to see a very diverse group here tonight to join hands to try to achieve a moratorium, as Hollis mentioned, on the timber cutting and burning by the Forestry Service, and most especially the massive cuts that would tend to lead to prairie-like conditions. We believe that needs to have a lot more study and needs to be stopped right now to have a lot more input on that. There have been many books written about between the lakes and between the rivers and the history of the area and so forth. And I don't want to rehash the past very much here, but there's a new one that came out a couple of years ago by an author, by a professor from University of Tennessee, that gives a sort of, he sort of answered some of the million-dollar questions that we wondered about. And so it sort of was new information to me and to many of us that have read this book now. His name is Ronald Foresta, and he wrote a book called The Land Between the Lakes, The History of a Forgotten Future. And he helps explain the question, why was TVA not happy with the 100,000 acres that they had to start with? Why were they not happy with that? And we never really knew the answer to it. It was asked at the Golden Pond School 50 years ago, why are you not happy with the 100,000 acres, for Christ's sake? And the TVA never answered the question. They didn't have to. So I'm going to try to explain here in about 2 minutes a 300-page book. But he had interviewed all the original TVA people that planned this, and he had notes that most of us had never seen before. So here we go. 300 pages in 1 minute. John Kenneth Galbraith was a leading economist back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. A famous economist. Mr. Galbraith believed that in studying the Industrial Revolution that work weeks would get shorter and shorter and shorter. He believed that with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of machines that the work weeks would get shorter and shorter. The TVA was trying to get into 50 years ago, getting away from making electricity and getting into social engineering and trying to expand their footprint and getting into recreation. So they hired people with titles like futurists, utopians, and they had recreation majors, and it became very heavily populated with those majors and those forms of study. They began to believe that. They began to believe that 40 hours would not be the standard work week, that 25 hours would be the standard work week by the time we got to the 80s, according to Mr. Foresta's documentation. And so when they had the opportunity to get the land between the lakes, they had a couple of advantages. That was going to be a national park. Jim Wallace has the maps. The original 100,000 acres in the wildlife refuge was going to be a national park. So when TVA was flipped the job of developing land between the lakes, they surprised everyone with the thought that they were going to take all 180. They were going to take the 80,000 acres also. So, but this is what they promised. They did a study on this shortened work week, and they wanted to make sure they took care of these people. 10 million visitors per year, new roads, 3 industrial parks would come simply because of this 180,000 acre park. 2 Gatlinburgs, one that would stretch from Canton to Cadiz would be a Gatlinburg. And there was warnings about how to develop the Gatlinburg. Now, I came through Canton just a minute ago, so unless somebody's built a bypass around the Gatlinburg there, I guess I missed the Gatlinburg. I blinked and missed the Gatlinburg. So opposition was fierce, but if you did the math on that, That was 51,000 people per day if you make some adjustment for wintertime. 51,000 people 7 days a week is what the TVA promised would hit LBL. A day. 17,000 cars a day. So that's why 100,000 acres wasn't enough. You couldn't cram 51,000 people a day into a small area like 100,000 acres that they already had. So I found that very interesting. Senators Cooper, John Sherman Cooper, and Senator Thurston Morton and Congressman Stubblefield were surprised and ambushed by the TVA when they announced, after getting flipped the project, that they were going to take the whole 80,000 acres at 4,700 that was lived on. Excuse me. You got a deal. I'm dealing with some laryngitis. Opposition. It was fierce opposition. It's kind of like we're doing here today. There was great interest and fierce opposition to the TVA. Senators Cooper and Thurston Morton went to Lyndon Johnson and asked Lyndon Johnson to put a stop to the TVA taking that much land and that much homeland because they thought they had enough property. At that point, Aubrey Wagner, the chairman of TVA, and Governor Ned Breathitt, became alarmed that they weren't going to be able to pull this project off then. So they went on a campaign that they hit the ground running. They finally convinced the press that 10 million visitors were coming, industrial parks were coming, Gatlinburgs and so forth. Gold was going to rain out of the sky on this region. And they did a good job because it was effective. They won that battle. They converted a lot of the newspapers that had been questioning the TVA to supporting the TVA, and thus, and a lot of the business community began to think, well, we're all going to get rich if we can just get that 80,000 acres away from those darn stubborn hillbillies between the rivers. We're going to have it made. So with all that pressure from the governor and from Aubrey Wagner, Lyndon Johnson would not back. We would not have them. He would not pull them back. So it was a lost cause. And for that, people like Mr. Atwood that he just mentioned paid a heavy price for that, for that change in direction. Only one small problem that Governor Breathitt had and Aubrey Wagner had and Lyndon Johnson had was that they were wrong, and all the utopians and John Galbraith, they were wrong about it, and so it caused irreversible damage to this area and to these families and to the entire region because tourism never came back once Fenton and other areas were destroyed. That's what we're here today to do, is make sure we don't do more irreversible damage to the land between the lakes. Results basically is that TVA, by their own benchmark, and even Foresta, decided and declared that the LBL, as was benchmarked by TVA, was a failure. And it was a failure. The LBL, but we believe LBL must be successful. It's in no one's best interest that it fail. In the mid-'80s then, 20 years down the road, as this 10 million people didn't show up, not very many people showed up, all the buildings fell into ruin. TVA gets into financial trouble, comes out with the 5 concepts that they were espousing, because they were in trouble, and the LBL at that point for them was just another rock tied around their neck, sinking them financially. So they were either going to sell it or they were going to develop it along one of 5 lines. A lot of you folks here were heroes from that battle 20 years ago.
Amen.
Yes, brother. And when, like today, fierce opposition has to appear, and it did at that period in time. Concept Zero was created, and a lot of you folks are the heroes of Concept Zero. Zellner Cossey was a judge executive of Tree County 20 years ago, and he fought hard. Everybody fought hard. And with the help, and that's a whole nother chapter, but with the help of Michael Pape, at that period of time, Congressman Whitfield and Senator McConnell, the TVA lost land between the lakes. their insidious signs were taken down. I got pictures of them coming down, by the way. And it was transferred to the Forestry Service, and subsequently the LBL Protection Act was passed. I'm going to read some excerpts on this latest controversy of this massive timber cut that I received quickly. This one person wrote, speaking for you, to me, they wrote, "You were robbed of your homeland and heritage, and long ago accepted you would never get it back. But you are committed to preserving it and protecting it as a recreation area and environmental education center for future generations. This is an unusual situation in American history. So you're to be congratulated for fighting for what you lost for all these years. Sadly, we are here again. Ironic situation of trying to save what we lost, trying to make sure that the promise of no commercialization, environmental education, and recreation are kept, and that the resource not be abused, as is what appears to be currently proposed by the Forestry Service. This time there is widespread, deep, and wide support. Wranglers, bikers, hikers, ATV enthusiasts, and hunters are all joined together, people that are not native between the rivers, to stop this latest blunder that has been exposed before it can do permanent damage and be restudied." Here's an excerpt from another email that I got after these people read the plan. These folks are from Chicago. They moved to Canton because they love the lake and they love land between the lakes. It says, an excerpt, "This is one of the most depressing things I've read in a long time. I've just returned to the BTR forest after a week of being snowbound and can't imagine what the rest of my life would be like without being able to enjoy it, not to mention the legacy or lack of we would be leaving for future generations. As I've said before, hiking across an open plain or a grassland isn't what I consider hiking. The peace and solitude and beauty and splendor of the forest is what makes it a special place. However, I really enjoy the peace and solitude the BTR has to offer. It is also concerning given the original intent of the project. As I understand it, it was meant to draw tourists as a national recreation area. And they mentioned that it's rare that they really see hikers in land between the lakes. It's pretty rare. If the management plans that I read about in Wade's correspondence were to come to pass, the beauty of BTR would forever be lost, and tourism that does exist could quickly fade away. Additionally, I found the language that the Forestry Service uses to describe their projects is particularly disturbing. For cutting and burning large areas of forest, they use the terms restoration and management. The only thing they appear to be managing is the timber harvest, and the pre-European landscape that they are supposed to be restoring is something that no one but the Forest Service seems to want. I have talked to not one single person who wants to see savannas or open grasslands when they cross those bridges." And then they offer to let this be shared. Lastly, John Woodruff was from Cadiz. A lot of you Tree Counties remember John. He was a very successful construction person, and he became the chairman of the Tri-County Commission for Constitutional Rights back in the 60s when we were first fighting the TVA. And John was a man that was very wealthy, but he was a man of few words, those of you that remember John. And he was fighting the TVA tooth and toenail. And he said, he asked 4 questions of the TVA, and one of which I remember well. What if this doesn't work, he asked the TVA. So you're going to displace 4,700 people. What if that doesn't work? There was no answer from the TVA. They had eminent domain powers that were finally stripped from them later, so they didn't answer his question. So Hollis and Wade are asking the same question that John asked 50 years ago. If we clear all this timber and create savannas, and it doesn't work, this is a 100-year mistake. As Wade has said many times, it's a 100-year mistake. The maintenance will probably overwhelm them. We believe that the roads need upgrading before messing with prairies, basically. The roads should be the priority and not prairies. Been many mistakes made in the land between the lake. We need to cease all cutting now and let it be re-examined by our leaders and by the public before restarting the timber cutting over there. It's still an important resource to our area. And if left alone, I think it'll take care of itself and be there for future generations that are going to need it, and it will become more precious as time goes along. Thank you, Hollis and Wade, for the time you've put in to make sure things happen right this time. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Michael Pape with Congressman Whitfield's office, who's always been a great friend of ours. Michael.